To give us the patient perspective.
Thanks very much. And you'll see I have patient in quotes up there because we're neither patient nor patient, I want to say to start. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we're often using this word, and I think language is really important, and as long as we keep the word patient, which is me sitting in a Johnny on a table with a tremendous information asymmetry and power asymmetry, then we won't really take into factoring into our work real world evidence in any way. It's remarkable to me that we sit in rooms like this, and what I do is I imagine, not like usually they tell speakers, imagine everyone naked and then you'll be calm. I don't do that. I imagine everybody is a person who cares first about their health and then second about something else, like a business or an industry. We'd make very different decisions than we do when we sit here primarily as professionals. And so what is this perspective then, if I'm not going to say the patient perspective? And I think this encapsulates it for me. If you're sitting here saying, I don't want to be here, I would not choose to be here, I would like to leave here, that's the patient perspective. I don't want to be here. I never wanted to be here. I would like to leave here because I'm here because I have 2 kids with a rare condition, genetic condition. I'm here because I'm CEO of Genetic Alliance, which represents millions and millions of people with diseases. Now, I'm not saying I don't enjoy my work, but I don't come to this primarily as a profession. I never did. I don't have credentials in this space. I have a master's in religious studies. So I think that's the difference we're talking about. And when we talk about real world evidence, we want to go there. What does that do, though? Essentially, it thrusts me into a space as a person to now become part of this conversation that I think is really important. And I really am thrilled that 24 years after my kids were diagnosed, we're having these kinds of conversations. Because 24 years ago, I found some lab space. I set up a biobank in my freezer. I put a spreadsheet together and started a registry. I found the gene for my kid's disease. I patented that gene so I'd stay the steward of its use. I went on to create a diagnostic test and went to FDA with that test. And then now I'm in clinical trials with 4 different drugs, all myself as a layperson. And that isn't remarkable. That was out of necessity because, as several people have mentioned, especially with rare conditions, there are 7,000 of them, will all be dead before we get to any of them. Communities have gathered evidence for years. Again, 24 years ago, I had a registry of thousands of people with a rare disease, 900 fields of data on those people over the last 24 years is what I've kept. So I have a lot of real world evidence, a lot of PRO. And while that's really terrific, it hasn't been integrated into any kind of system that makes it easy. Every single thing we do in communities working on this kind of issue is an uphill battle because we have to go hire researchers, we have to go hire data analysts, and we have to hire companies essentially to do it. And then when something is interesting, we certainly start to see a sea change, and we're seeing that overall. I think that's really terrific, even with regard to rare diseases, because as the blockbuster models dry up, the companies are now opening rare disease divisions. It'll remain to be seen whether that's going to be a lucrative way to do this. So these communities have been organizing themselves to represent patients in many ways, everything from AIDS activists a long, long time ago to more Facebook and Twitter kind of friendly communities that are looking for ways to put evidence together that could impact the medical system. And the bottom line for me is, when are we going to start to pay attention to that information and not keep comparing it to other sources of information? We need it all. And someone remarked that people, in fact, do care about evidence, and we know that. We know that in other industries, for example, Consumer Reports, Angie's List, and the rating of your Uber or Lyft driver are all important to you, and people know how to look at those things. And they certainly would like to look at them in medicine and health. They're more black box, they're more difficult to look at, et cetera. So we can't do those things yet, but I think we get that we really do want to do those things. We're seeing more and more of these less brick and mortar kinds of organizations. So my organizations have always been brick and mortar. They've been incorporated and have boards of directors, et cetera. And now we're seeing individuals make a difference about collecting evidence quickly and then applying it, and even getting to the point where they're getting to drug development, et cetera. I'm going to just use one example because of the short time that we each have around registries. So registries as portals into real-world evidence, and I think that the community-facing and affinity-facing and advocacy-based registries have been somewhat dissed over all these years, saying, well, how do we know what you're collecting is right? How do we know people told the truth? How do we know this evidence is actually evidence? And in fact, we've seen in the traditional medical and healthcare system, the EMR, other places even in terms of collecting data in a strict clinical trial, there have been mistakes made, and there have been questions about the evidence that we've gathered in those instances, and we could all name lots and lots of things that we've either made clinical guideline decisions based on and then retracted them a few years later because of more evidence. All of this is because it's real world. All of this is because we're all N's of ones, and when we put all of these data together, we're really trying to make a decision. And I think using the registries that armies of people have collected, and in fact, someone else talked about natural language processing. Groups like Facebook and Google are doing phenomenal numbers of trials right now based on that information that people are sharing, and sometimes sharing inadvertently with each other that we're not taking into consideration yet. I think we will see these two worlds converge, and I'll talk about that a little in a second. We've also had pretty formal structures, things like the National Health Council have put together roundtables, groups of patients to look at real-world evidence, so we're starting to see some structure to what before was, in a sense, a Wild West. So I think these community-based, and by community I mean things like communities of individuals who live with HIV status, communities of individuals who are working in homeless communities. For example, one of the patient-powered research networks of PCORNet, of which I'm a co-PI with Rich Platt and Adrian Hernandez, working on. We have communities now of LGBTQ groups across the United States, affinity groups around a medical device, affinity groups around an adverse event, affinity groups around what is it like to live with my kid with autism and he wants to be integrated into the school system. So these affinity groups are starting to put together registries as well. Genetic Alliance is running one for the state of Pennsylvania on the health effects of fracking. So we're seeing lots and lots of ways people are starting to integrate this evidence, and certainly with things like wearables and lots of other tracking devices, et cetera, there's a lot of opportunity to collect information, as someone said in the beginning. So we're seeing these communities start to gather what's the evidence of the lived condition. When a community or an affinity group runs a registry, it's pretty different than when, for example, the one-off one run by industry is populated and then closed at the end of a study. It's pretty different than the ones that are put up and set up by hospitals because it generally includes more of the lived experience of the individual. And when individuals are running these registries who are based in the community, again, who don't want to be there, didn't want to cross that line, don't want to live here, the goals are different, the kind of priority setting is already inherent, rather than trying to do a focus group around what are your priorities while I try to make my bottom line. It's instead, what are my priorities as an individual? I think understanding the opportunities and risks and the decisions for the community are easier in that regard too. So again, great experiment is PCORNet. We have 20 of these patient-powered research networks. What we're looking at is how do we set priorities in the communities. Those rise really fast in the community. The community is demanding answers to certain things. And so it's fast to set the priorities to answer the questions that are important to people. We do need rigorous and accessible methods for validation. So those of us who have been in this game, again, I wrote my first registry 24 years ago at my kitchen table, and now I'm working on much more professional style and validated registries. It's really hard for us to get the instruments we use validated. And one could say, well, just use the ones that are already validated. That's not so easy. There certainly are indices of these. For example, NIH keeps some of them, but even they are not well indexed or correlated or corroborated. The way to validate an instrument, as many of us know, to validate measures is difficult. There's like very, very high bars for those, and they should be rigorous, but they also should be accessible in some way, and we should be working toward processes and methods to get there much faster as well. And then integrating evidence, education into the registry experience is easy in a community because it's part of the process of being there. Unlike a hospital or an industry study where we're looking at how do we deal with somebody in 7 minutes or 10 minutes or 11 minutes or the 3-hour visit to the clinical setting for the research, we have the opportunity to interact daily with people through Facebook, through chat lists, et cetera, and lots of opportunity for educating them. So I think that makes all of that much more easy. So I'm just going to quickly show you, and I'm not going to actually go into it in much detail, a registry system that we put together, because the other question that constantly comes up around registries and around real-world evidence and tracking devices and wearables is privacy and what are the preferences of people. And essentially what we did is we put together something called a platform for engaging everyone responsibly. We have 50 communities on this platform using it to build the evidence they need to either get academic group or an industry sponsor to look at the disease, or in fact to put forward the trials themselves that will lead to some solutions. And essentially allowing every community, again, any kind of community, to put this into their own system to look like them, taste like them, smell like them, so that the community feels that strong affinity. I'm an advisor for the PMI, for the Precision Medicine Initiative, all of us, and I keep saying over and over there, is people are not going to ascribe to something that's national or international. They're going to ascribe to their own community. They're going to feel that they're part of a community. Starting with tradition is probably a great way to go, because there's identity that we have in our communities that I think we really need to keep. This portal allows individuals to set up their own privacy settings and to put their contact information into the portal with those privacy settings in 2 separate databases, so they're not connected to one another. Very hard to hack because of the separateness of these natures, and then to actually enter PRO, lab records, radiographic records, et cetera, all into a health database. So 3 databases. A data holder then is the individual who's providing all of this information and is holding this data themselves in this system. So each individual becomes essentially an owner or purveyor of their own data and allows others to access that data. The preference setting is done with guides from the community who look like the person, who have the same socioeconomic status, who have the same experience of the disease to some degree. We're also doing this in healthy communities like the American Nurse Midwives Association and the births that they're having too. So data seekers can come along and they can ask, can I have contact information? Well, first I have to check the privacy directives, and that will tell me whether or not I can. Can I have health data? That again, I have to ping the privacy directives, and then it will tell me if I can. Again, this is just an example, and there are quite a few of places where individuals, this is completely lay, designed, implemented, managed, run from the top to the bottom, with advisors certainly from the clinical community, from the research community, regulatory communities, lawyers, et cetera, but all driven by what matters to people most, and putting these tools in people's hands to make decisions about where these data will go. I should say, of the tens of thousands of people whose data is in this system, about 95% say share my data with everybody. About 5% say ask me, because we allow this maybe middle ground, which a lot of registry systems don't. And then about 5% say no, nobody can have my information. We can't study why those people said that, because we can't have their information. But we do get quite a number of people, a vast majority, saying yes. So I'm going to close with this phrase that I heard from a Native American friend about 30 years ago: nothing about us without us. It's been attributed to lots of people since then, usually white men in prestigious positions. But it really, at least I heard it from a Native American woman who had not even gone to high school. And I think the bottom line for me is this, that as we talk about real world evidence, and we have to talk about it the way we are today, which is all the systems, clinical systems, payer, community, regulators, et cetera, we need to keep remembering that we're talking about something on the other hand that's quite simple, and that is our own lived experience. We're each an expert in ourselves. We're each the expert for ourselves. Now, we do have to aggregate that in a way that is rigorous and clear. We also want it to be generalizable, which we know that we struggle with. So I would say let's unleash the power of these communities that I think in many ways have taken over a lot of the burden of other parts of the industry that we have had some successes with, and let's build on those successes. Let's keep people in the center. And let's not lose sight of what matters. Real-world evidence absolutely matters. It's going to be critical for us to do anything going forward. But let's really be open-minded about how we're going to bring that into this equation. And remember that people are ready, willing, and able to do that. We need to be flexible. We need to figure out how to facilitate that. But we shouldn't always start from the premise of our regulation or our industry or our academic viewpoint, but instead go back to the core of who each of us is, because at the end of the day, while you may want to label me or somebody else as a patient, every single one of us is. And I don't even mean that in an all lives matters kind of way, because that's very offensive to the people who are desperately suffering. But I do mean that a piece of every single one of us, either ourselves or our loved ones, are suffering from something, and we've got to change this sooner than later. And so what I ask each of us to do is to actually turn toward what it is we fear, turn toward the thing that makes us uncomfortable in this situation. If we start to defend something, back away for a minute and give that some time and space, and look at how can we really make this decision different? How can we take a risk like our loved ones or ourselves are taking risks every day around our health? And how can we do something that's bigger than each one of us? Thank you.